Between 1954 and 1961, 11 men affiliated with a rural monastery in eastern Iowa were officially marked as transferred by their order. No public records were ever updated. No arrival logs exist at the destinations listed. Internally, the institution maintained silence, even as concerned family members attempted to trace their whereabouts. Decades later, a retired state archivist reviewing church property deeds noted irregular transactions and references to internal reports not found in any catalogue. What emerged was not a story of mysticism or martyrdom, but of slow and systematic administrative erasure. Founded in 1886, the St. Ignatius Refuge presented itself as a haven for spiritual rehabilitation within the monastic tradition. Located near the Iowa-Illinois border, the compound was not a public retreat, but a cloistered facility maintained by the Order of Sacred Moderation. The order was known for its administrative precision and self-imposed austerity. Public relations material from the 1950s emphasized simplicity, prayer, and silence. Annual newsletters described small-scale agriculture, theological study, and structured seclusion. Few outsiders visited. Those who did found the grounds serene, with little indication of institutional strain. But from 1954 through 1961, one friar per year ceased appearing in group documentation. Each absence was followed by a line item in an internal ledger noting relocation, though no monastery ever confirmed receiving them. The Order of Sacred Moderation maintained a reputation for administrative rigor. Unlike other monastic institutions that operated with looser clerical record-keeping, this order emphasized meticulous reporting. Every incoming novice, departing elder, and liturgical event was archived with precise notations. This was especially true at St. Ignatius Refuge, which functioned more as a controlled environment than an open monastery. By 1950, the refuge housed no more than 30 friars at any given time, most assigned indefinitely under internal vows. The monastery had been built in stages. The original stone chapel was completed by 1890, with a dormitory wing added in 1895. Over the next half-century, additional buildings were erected to accommodate a print shop, agricultural storage, and private quarters for long-term contemplatives. No public masses were held. Instead, internal routines governed daily life: canonical hours, assigned meditations, and periodic group silence. The monastery operated under a formal charter with the regional ecclesiastical authority, but was financially self-sufficient. Its internal economy was based on three outputs: hand-bound theological texts, heirloom vegetable cultivation, and wax products derived from a contained apiary system. These products were distributed to affiliated institutions across the Midwest. Sales were coordinated through a regional distributor operated by the order itself. Receipts and correspondence passed through a clerical office staffed by 2 friars with semi-permanent administrative roles. The friars rotated duties, but certain individuals were designated as record custodians. Brother Leopold Grange, who served as archivist between 1949 and 1958, was one such individual. A former parish accountant prior to entering monastic life, Grange implemented a redundant ledger protocol that required each internal decision, transfers, disciplinary reviews, vocational approvals, to be logged in 2 parallel systems. One was a numeric register for order-wide summaries. The other was a narrative ledger housed in a restricted cabinet in the refuge's library annex. It was this cabinet, decades later, that would raise questions. By outward metrics, the refuge did not appear to change much through the 1950s. The same annual report template was used from 1948 through 1962, with only minor variations in names. No new construction was noted. Membership lists fluctuated slightly, with occasional entries marked sent for recuperation or transferred to province care. These lines were accepted by most without concern. The friars who left never returned, but the order maintained that reassignment was a normal part of cloistered life. In 1954, however, a pattern began that would escape scrutiny for nearly 2 decades. Brother Albinus Krell, age 37, was listed in the spring roster as active meditation steward. By the fall update, he was no longer included. His name did not appear under departures, nor under final vows concluded. A notation in the internal numeric ledger stated, "Relocated, order discretion." No date was attached, no forwarding location was named. This phrasing would recur annually through 1961. Unlike other monasteries that shared occasional personnel updates with diocesan leadership, the Order of Sacred Moderation used coded correspondence. Each letter was categorized by tier: green for routine matters, gray for internal transfers, and red for high-order evaluation. None of the 11 friars listed under relocated order discretion had accompanying red or green letters filed. Gray letters existed, but many were misdated or lacked signatures. Several were routed through the office of Brother Leopold Grange, who retired to a private care facility in 1964 with no official farewell. The monastic yearbooks, produced biennially, featured group photographs of the resident friars in front of the main dormitory. Beginning in 1955, each edition showed a slightly smaller group. No explanation was provided. The surrounding grounds looked unchanged. The dormitory windows remained shuttered in the same pattern. Crops rotated seasonally, and the annual letter from the abbot repeated identical phrasing about spiritual health and collective focus. By the end of the decade, local deliverymen and regional vendors had quietly remarked on the declining number of visible friars during weekly drop-offs. One such vendor, an Iowa City contractor who delivered wax packaging supplies to several monastic clients, noted in a 1973 deposition that St. Ignatius Refuge always signed invoices with different handwriting, even when the name was the same. His statement was part of a broader civil audit unrelated to the monastery, but later cited in a clerical review. The contractor also recalled an unusual number of signature stamps used by the Refuge beginning in 1956. At the time, this seemed like an efficiency measure. Later, it complicated efforts to verify who had actually approved routine shipments. Internally, the leadership structure remained consistent. Abbot Francis Hogg served without interruption from 1944 until his death in 1962. His handwritten journals, stored in the Motherhouse archive, included daily entries on weather, crop yields, and spiritual progress. Not once did he refer to a friar's unexplained departure. Even when Brother Irenaeus Weber vanished mid-season in 1957, no mention was made in the abbot's book. An official copy of his vows remained on file, but his room was reassigned within weeks. The official line from the Order of Sacred Moderation emphasized uniformity, but subtle shifts in documentation protocols began appearing by late 1957. Previously consistent margins in transfer logs became irregular. Ink colors that had been standardized to black began varying from entry to entry, sometimes within a single document. Occasional misspellings, previously unheard of in the carefully maintained ledgers, appeared in the names of friars whose status had been updated to relocated order discretion. Brother Clement Frau, a clerk known for his meticulous calligraphy, stepped down from his record-keeping duties in early 1958, citing schedule reassignment in an internal memo. His replacement, Brother Elric Hess, adopted typewritten entries in place of handwritten ones. The switch was explained as a modernization step, yet only a portion of records transitioned to the new format. Documents from 1958 to 1961 exist in a mixture of styles, sometimes alternating formats across consecutive pages. The narrative ledger began showing abbreviated phrases and non-standard indexing. The internal library annex, once accessible by formal request to any friar in good standing, was restricted in 1959 to clerical clearance only. This restriction coincided with the refurbishment of the main archive cabinet, which was removed for repairs and never returned. When a replacement was installed the following year, it contained significantly fewer folders. Multiple categories, including non-renewed vows and retired from contemplative cycle, had been combined into a general heading titled Inactive Status. This new designation lacked definition. In practice, it encompassed all friars not presently listed on site, whether reassigned, deceased, or unaccounted for. It was applied retroactively. Brother Albinus Krell, whose name had disappeared in 1954, was now classified under this revised heading. None of the associated documentation explained the retroactive change. Dates in the revised entries differed by several weeks from those in earlier ledgers. Handwritten notations in the margins had been crossed out in pencil. These inconsistencies were not discussed publicly. Internally, routine continued. The monastic kitchen received regular deliveries. The apiary maintained sufficient output to fulfill regional orders. Incoming postulants were fewer than in earlier decades, but application records indicated a modest intake through the early 1960s. Those who entered after 1955 were rarely placed on long-term assignments. Most served for fewer than 3 years, cycling out through formal diocesan referral or returning to secular clergy paths. No formal explanation was offered for this shift. The novitiate program was also quietly adjusted. The standard 3-year preparatory cycle was shortened to 18 months. Group instruction sessions on liturgical interpretation were reduced, and individualized vocational evaluations were emphasized. Brother Orrin Clasp, who oversaw novitiate education from 1952 to 1960, implemented a series of private interviews without written summaries. When asked in later correspondence to provide records of these assessments, he replied that they had been vocationally conclusive, but undocumented by design. Abbot Francis Hogg maintained public composure during these years, continuing correspondence with affiliated abbots across the region. Yet in a rare missive dated July 1959, addressed to an abbot in southern Wisconsin, he noted the administrative imprecision creeping into our rotation logs. The letter was not shared during his lifetime. It was found years later, filed in an unrelated collection of agricultural inventories. The Wisconsin abbot never responded to the query. Despite growing anomalies in the documentation, local diocesan authorities raised no concerns. The Order of Sacred Moderation operated with sufficient autonomy that direct oversight was minimal. Quarterly reports were submitted on time. No external audits were requested. Regional bishops received standard updates without irregularities. The quiet nature of the refuge, coupled with its perceived spiritual rigor, discouraged intrusion. In early 1960, an internal memo from Brother Elric Hess recommended the discontinuation of individual profile folders. He argued that centralizing records into collective summaries would streamline administrative efficiency. The proposal was approved without amendment. Within weeks, individual history files for over 24 friars were condensed into one bound volume labeled Cycle Registrations. The original files were not archived, but removed. No inventory was recorded of the extracted materials. Brother Jasper Linney, who handled maintenance and groundskeeping during the same period, later noted that large quantities of paper waste were burned in the monastery's rear garden furnace in the spring of 1960. The furnace was typically used for wax purification and small debris disposal. On this occasion, he stated in a written testimonial dated 1978, "The volume of burned material was more than I'd seen in all my years combined." No formal statement was filed at the time. As the Refuge entered 1961, only minor outward signs hinted at internal changes. The orchard yielded a reduced harvest that year, attributed to frost. The annual beekeeping order was delayed by 3 weeks, citing transport difficulties. Hand-bound theological texts were produced in smaller batches. Several titles were repeated with altered covers, but identical content. The final roster for that year listed 19 friars in residence, the lowest number since the 1930s. Brother Matthias Erlin, age 40, was the final individual to be classified under relocated order discretion. His entry, unlike those before him, included a 3-line footnote referencing accelerated vocational reassessment. The note bore no signature. The next quarterly update listed his name under inactive status. No communication was recorded with any external monastery confirming his reassignment. His assigned quarters were emptied the following month. The 1961 year-end review included no narrative commentary. Previous editions had included a paragraph reflecting on the spiritual theme of the year. This time, only numerical data was provided. The total number of active friars, production units, and devotional hours were listed in tabular form. A single line at the bottom noted, "Balance achieved through internal recalibration." No elaboration followed. In February 1962, Abbot Haug passed away in his sleep at age 71. His final logbook entry, made the evening prior, mentioned the return of cold weather and included a brief note on seed ordering for spring. He named no successor. Within a month, an acting superior was installed by the mother house. The new administrator, Brother Eustace Verne, ordered a complete inventory of on-site personnel and resources. This was the first internal audit in over 20 years. The personnel inventory found multiple rooms listed in the maintenance register that no longer corresponded to existing keys. Several keys labeled with room numbers did not match any doors. Certain file cabinets in the library annex were locked without available access. Brother Verne requested locksmith services from a neighboring institution. When opened, several drawers were found to be empty, despite being marked secured materials. No friars were formally reported missing. All 11 cases had been categorized in ways that precluded investigation. Yet none had reassignment letters acknowledged by receiving monasteries. All had left behind personal effects that were subsequently reassigned or stored without inventory. In each case, final references were made only in internal ledgers, without diocesan notification. This pattern was maintained through administrative continuity. The systems did not break, they adjusted. The documentation altered format. The explanations adapted terminology. At no point did the process halt or reveal distress. From the outside, the Refuge remained a model of order. The first formal attempt to account for the 11 absent friars occurred in 1974, more than a decade after the final unexplained entry. It began not with an inquiry from within the church, but as a side project of a state archivist reviewing property tax exemptions for religious institutions. This individual, Raymond Tuttle, had been tasked with confirming deed records for facilities held in perpetual exemption status. St. Ignatius Refuge, still registered under the Order of Sacred Moderation, had retained exemption on all its structures despite several of them being marked non-operational in county files since 1965. Tuttle's assignment was bureaucratic in scope. He contacted various institutions to verify usage declarations and building status updates. Most responded with standard forms. The Refuge sent a letter on official stationery with no signature and a typed affirmation of unchanged status as contemplative residence. The letter lacked date formatting, but was postmarked from Iowa City. The signature block listed Office of the Vow Custodian with no name. While this did not technically violate procedure, Tuttle flagged it for follow-up. In reviewing the Land Survey Index, he noticed discrepancies in the acreage under religious exemption. The 1952 plat map recorded 46.3 acres under monastery use. By 1974, the official property file stated 38.1 acres. No sale or transfer had been logged in the county assessor's ledger. A small parcel marked as Orchard Annex appeared to have been reclassified in the mid-1960s as non-monastic use, but no change of use certificate was filed. Tuttle's interest shifted from routine verification to a methodical audit of all filings linked to the Refuge over the prior 2 decades. Among these, he located a list of maintenance invoices dating back to 1956. The majority of these had been routed through a third-party intermediary called DeMille Services, an entity with a post office box and no listed business address. No incorporation record existed under that name. Several of the invoices were signed by R. Grange or L. Hess, despite the fact that Brother Leopold Grange had formally retired in 1964 and Brother Elric Hess was believed to have transferred in 1966. At this point, Tuttle submitted a formal inquiry to the Iowa Secretary of State's office regarding DeMille Services. The reply indicated that no such business had ever registered with the state, nor had any religious institution applied for a license under that name. Further, an internal index of vendors with active standing with religious exemptions showed no entries corresponding to the invoice details submitted by the Refuge. Tuttle documented these findings in a provisional memo addressed to his division director. The memo was initially filed without action. Only in 1976, during a wider review of tax-exempt holdings for dormant or irregular religious institutions, was the memo rediscovered and attached to a joint subcommittee report. The subcommittee, composed of archivists, auditors, and legal consultants, included one member with prior experience in ecclesiastical archives. This member, Judith Palfrey, proposed a limited review of monastic records held by the Order of Sacred Moderation's regional authority. Permission was granted for a 3-day review period. Palfrey traveled to the Mother House facility in northeastern Missouri, where she was given supervised access to the Order's archive. The documents she examined confirmed that St. Ignatius Refuge had maintained operational status through the early 1960s. Transfer reports were present, but showed irregularities. Specifically, between 1954 and 1961, transfer letters were listed in abstract, but no destination confirmation letters were archived. Each abstract included the phrase, "internal placement confirmed," but none included identifying signatories from the receiving institutions. In cross-referencing names listed under those transfer abstracts, Palfrey identified 11 friars with identical phrasing. Relocated, order discretion. This matched the internal logs noted by Tuttle, although Palfrey's access was limited to summaries rather than full personnel files. None of the 11 names appeared in subsequent newsletters or vocational updates. Several of the monasteries listed as destinations no longer existed, having closed or merged during the broader church consolidations of the late 1960s. Palfrey compiled her observations in a typed brief sent to the subcommittee. She noted that while no direct violation of exemption protocol had occurred, the administrative record showed a pattern of non-standard reclassification and deficient verification. She recommended an official request for internal files from the Refuge itself. The subcommittee issued a formal letter to the acting superior, which was returned unopened with a handwritten notation, "no longer processed through site-level clerical functions." By 1977, the subcommittee had compiled a dossier of inconsistencies. These included financial records routed through unverifiable vendors, unacknowledged personnel reclassifications, and structural discrepancies in facility use. Among the findings was a 1960 invoice for furnace repair that listed both materials and document disposal under a single work order. The disposal portion was vague, listing archival matter under a general waste heading. The document trail prompted a request to the Diocese of Davenport, under whose ecclesiastical jurisdiction the Refuge technically fell. The diocesan archivist, however, stated that the Order of Sacred Moderation operated independently and had never submitted personnel updates for St. Ignatius Refuge beyond standard annual summaries. When asked whether the diocese had received notice of friar transfers or departures, the archivist replied that no such notifications had been required under the canonical structure in place at the time. In parallel, Tuttle conducted a review of city directories and seminary placement bulletins. Several of the 11 friars in question had previously appeared in such directories prior to their arrival at the Refuge. After their final listing at St. Ignatius, no public entries could be located. He then reviewed diocesan necrologies for any references to the names. None appeared. This was unusual, as even reclusive monastics typically received brief entries upon their death, if only to complete the record. One file linked to Brother Albinus Krell contained a page from an earlier monastic census in which his vocational path was traced from initial postulancy in 1938 through his final listed role in 1954. The file ended with a marginal note reading, "Final reassignment, confirmed verbally." The handwriting was not signed or dated. The original census document, preserved only in carbon duplicate, bore the watermark of a discontinued print series used only through 1956. Meanwhile, the St. Ignatius Refuge itself had undergone a visible reduction in personnel by the late 1970s. Aerial survey photographs commissioned by the state showed several outbuildings boarded and a reduction in cultivated acreage. A 1978 site visit by a land use researcher noted that only 7 residents appeared during a 3-day observation window. Most structures showed signs of minimal upkeep, though the main chapel and dormitory remained in serviceable condition. Attempts to interview active members were not successful. The acting superior declined all communication. No public liaison had been assigned. Parcel mail sent to individual friars was returned with a standard notice indicating internal review only. A final query submitted to the Mother House regarding the 11 friars received a reply stating that all personnel transitions from the period in question had been handled in accordance with contemplative statute. By this point, public interest was minimal. No criminal allegations had been made. The irregularities were procedural, not prosecutorial. Still, the archivists noted that the level of internal document consolidation, combined with the absence of external confirmations, warranted further study. The case did not advance within formal channels, but was filed under the category of incomplete reconciliations. The subcommittee disbanded in 1979. Her final internal memo written by Palfrey before her departure from the archival division included a summary observation. There exists a repeated classification structure used in absence of record. That structure was maintained not to conceal, but to finalize without trace. After the archival subcommittee disbanded, the files related to St. Ignatius Refuge were transferred to the state's religious exemption archive under the classification Resolved, no action required. Most documents were stored off-site. By 1983, only one file remained in active rotation, flagged for follow-up should further correspondence arise. No such correspondence was received. The case appeared dormant. In 1986, however, a separate state-level initiative to digitize rural land use records brought renewed attention to the refuge's classification. As part of this project, regional field agents conducted visual surveys of tax-exempt parcels to confirm structures, boundaries, and declared purposes. The refuge, listed under active religious use, was visited in early May. The agent, Lowell Erdrich, submitted a routine visual assessment, noting the existence of cultivated land, visible outbuildings, and a recently repainted dormitory structure. Erdrich's notes included a standard checklist, with only one item marked as uncertain. Under number of site personnel encountered, he recorded no reply at entrance gate. A second line noted, movement observed in rear structure, followed by the phrase no signage, no point of contact. The report did not raise concerns, but it was filed with an attached notation recommending periodic review due to lack of direct confirmation. This would have remained procedural had it not intersected with an unrelated records recovery initiative conducted by a private university in Des Moines. The university's Department of American Religious History had received a donation of unsorted files from a decommissioned diocesan annex. Among the materials was a locked folio marked with a number series used by the Order of Sacred Moderation in the early 1960s. After obtaining permission to open and scan the contents, the department found several internal correspondences from 1959 through 1962 referencing personnel transitions at St. Ignatius Refuge. One letter, dated April 18, 1961, included a list of inactive vocations approved for retention status. The names included 8 of the 11 friars previously flagged by the subcommittee. The document used internal classification codes not seen in any public registry. Each name was followed by a status abbreviation not defined in any accessible legend. Our cover page described the list as secure for internal tracking, external reference non-viable. The university forwarded a copy of the letter to the State Archive, noting its potential relevance to previously unresolved audits. This prompted a brief internal discussion but no formal reopening of the case. The letter was filed alongside the prior dossier, now labeled Archival Reference Only. Throughout the late 1980s, attempts were made by individual researchers to access the refuge for academic purposes. These included requests to study monastic agricultural techniques, liturgical routines, and internal governance. All applications were declined. One applicant, Professor Dorian Kells from a Midwestern seminary, received a reply from the Mother House stating that the refuge maintains a state of uninterrupted seclusion and does not participate in external survey initiatives. In a footnote included in a 1989 publication on independent orders, Kells remarked on the unusually uniform tone of all correspondence received from the Order of Sacred Moderation. He observed that responses lacked variation in style, suggesting that a template had been adopted for all external replies. The implication was not one of deception, but of systematic distancing. The note ended with a comment. Such distance may shield legacy, but it erodes record. No friar associated with the Refuge granted an interview during this period. Inquiries sent to former members of the order, including those who had retired to diocesan care homes, yielded limited responses. One such former member, contacted in 1991 under conditions of anonymity, stated only that assignments at the Refuge were not expected to continue beyond set cycles. When asked to elaborate, the respondent clarified that reassignment after contemplative saturation was managed through higher discretion. No additional context was offered. In 1992, during routine digitization of state personnel directories, a clerical error led to the inclusion of an outdated listing for Brother Elric Hess under active status. His last known role had ended more than 2 decades prior. A staff member attempting to verify the data found that no Social Security or retirement record could be located under his registered vocational name. A cross-reference with his secular name, Ernst L. Hess, revealed no civilian employment or pension filings. The State Archive flagged this absence, though no legal action followed. The file was labeled closed with incomplete attribution. By this time, the terminology of the 1950s and 1960s had become difficult to reconcile with contemporary data systems. Multiple names from the original list no longer appeared in any government database, as their assignments had remained under monastic documentation protocols not integrated into civil tracking. In 1995, the university that had uncovered the internal classification list published an annotated study on non-integrated monastic records. St. Ignatius Refuge was included in a chapter on limited disclosure orders, a term the authors used to describe religious institutions that maintained operational continuity without external verification. The study did not allege impropriety, but noted that a sustained absence of reciprocal record-keeping renders the internal history unreconstructible. Following the publication, interest in the case briefly resurged among academic circles. A seminar held in Minneapolis in 1996 discussed the implications of non-verifiable transitions within religious institutions. One panelist presented a visual timeline of the 11 friars using the limited data available. Gaps were highlighted in red, with transfer points marked as unverifiable. The timeline ended in 1961 with a note reading, "Status unreconciled through 1996. Despite these renewed discussions, no further records emerged. The Order of Sacred Moderation declined to participate in follow-up correspondence. The Refuge itself remained listed as active in ecclesiastical directories, but with no listed liaison or public representative. The grounds, according to county tax rolls, were maintained under permanent exemption with no change of ownership. By 1999, the topic had returned to archival obscurity. The friars' names remained absent from public memorials or necrologies. Their final entries in internal ledgers continued to use the same phrase, relocated, order discretion. No additional documentation clarified the designation. No audit had authority to compel disclosure. The cycle of inquiry, file review, and classification had repeated over multiple decades. Each stage affirmed the same outcome: missing names, procedural finality, and a closed system that altered terminology without breaching formality. In 2003, an independent archival project sponsored by a non-profit consortium began digitizing diocesan records from across the Midwest. The initiative aimed to preserve documentation from orders that had disbanded or consolidated during the restructuring of the late 20th century. Among the project's contributors was a retired systems librarian named Francis Delroy, who had previously worked in cataloging private theological collections. Delroy's assignment included scanning correspondence logs and administrative files from multiple orders. While reviewing a sequence of unsorted materials from a dissolved Missouri priory, she encountered a partially labeled folder marked Moderation, Administrative Summary, 1961. It contained carbon copies of interoffice memoranda, shipping logs, and notation sheets listing inventory numbers with no item descriptions. The item numbers followed a sequence consistent with that used by the Order of Sacred Moderation. A subset of the documents contained hand-typed summaries referencing closed cycle assets and site asset redirection, phrases not defined in any standard archival glossary. The tone of the documents was procedural, written for internal use. No narrative context accompanied them. Delroy flagged the folder for specialized review. While the consortium's guidelines discouraged open-ended inquiry, exceptions were permitted for unresolved classifications. She submitted a request to trace the asset logs against known shipping records from the mother house. The reply confirmed the numbers matched a 1961 inventory reduction list filed during administrative transition following the death of Abbot Francis Haug. Included in the file was a 4-page record labeled Transition Verification, 3rd Quarter. It consisted of a list of 27 items marked for reallocation or removal from the St. Ignatius site. Most entries were machinery, furnishings, or materials. One line listed Dormitory 3 Cycle Designates. This phrase had not appeared in any other documentation reviewed by the digitization team. Delroy consulted an index of institutional terminology developed during the early years of the Order's operation. The term cycle designate was used historically to refer to friars who had reached full monastic engagement and no longer participated in communal liturgy. Instead, they remained in solitary roles devoted to fixed disciplines, such as transcription or agricultural oversight. The term's appearance in the 1961 document was anomalous. By that time, the use of cycle designate had reportedly been phased out. Delroy located an internal policy revision from 1956 stating that the term was no longer valid under updated vocational structuring. Yet its reappearance in a transition record, especially in conjunction with a dormitory reference, raised questions. The phrase was not qualified by context. No personal names were included. The 4th page of the document included a list of initials, 6 in total, arranged vertically without titles. Cross-referencing with personnel rosters revealed that 5 of the 6 initials matched names of friars classified under relocated order discretion between 1954 and 1961. The 6th did not correspond to any known friar, at least not under a recorded name. Further examination of the folder uncovered a duplicate document bearing a handwritten notation in the lower margin. Confirmed against Register 4A. Return to archive if no update. The origin of the note was unclear. The handwriting did not match any known clerical samples from the mother house. Register 4A was not listed among the Order's main archival ledgers. Delroy compiled her findings in a private report to the consortium's advisory panel. Though the material did not contain definitive contradictions, it demonstrated a pattern of documentation overlap between administrative transition and unresolved vocational records. Her report included scanned images of the original folder, a comparative chart of initials, and a timeline of terminology usage within the Order. While the panel reviewed the submission, Delroy independently contacted a theological librarian at a Benedictine college in Minnesota, who had previously collaborated on rural order histories. The librarian, Patrick Lyle, offered to conduct a parallel search through microfiche copies of regional supply requisitions submitted by monastic orders during the 1950s and 60s. Within 2 weeks, Lyle identified a set of records filed under the supplier D&B Stockade Co., a Minneapolis firm that had processed industrial orders for enclosed religious facilities. The Refuge had submitted multiple orders between 1957 and 1960. One document stood out, a 1959 requisition for modular cot systems described as non-communal housing issue, fixed placement. The order quantity was 11. The language of the order was impersonal. No recipient was listed. No justification was provided. Lyle noted that the phrasing diverged from the typical monastic vocabulary used in other orders' requisitions. Most monasteries requested furnishings for communal use. The term fixed placement suggested permanent installation, which was atypical. The refugee's requisition was signed only with the abbreviation Hess, presumed to be Brother Elric Hess. The document did not include a purchase order number or reference line. No invoice was attached. Delroy integrated the new finding into her report, attaching it as supplemental material. She submitted a revised version to the consortium, highlighting that the number 11 had recurred with precise consistency. 11 fixed placement cot systems, 11 cycle designations listed without names, 11 friars classified under relocated order discretion within the same 7-year period. The panel acknowledged the report but refrained from drawing conclusions. The consortium's role was not investigative. Its responsibility lay in preservation and cataloguing. The documents were reclassified as of interest, cross-reference authorized. No further review was planned. In 2004, Delroy traveled to the Iowa State Historical Society's microfilm archives, where she accessed building code filings from Jackson County for the period 1955 to 1962. St. Ignatius Refuge had filed 3 code updates during that span. The 1956 filing listed plumbing extensions to detached structure C. The 1959 update noted a reflooring of interior access corridor within the primary dormitory. The 1961 filing, however, referred to a decommissioning of West Corridor units, designation transferred. No schematic or diagram accompanied the filing. The terminology again lacked explanation. Decommissioning of residential units was rare among orders with steady populations. Transfer of designation implied either a reassignment of usage or a consolidation, yet population records from that year showed no influx or outflux outside the noted 11. In her final notation to the panel, Delroy remarked that the documentary pattern did not point to mismanagement, but to a system of procedural finalization that consistently closed entries without public acknowledgement. Her final sentence read, "When designation replaces identity, the archive cannot name what it contains." Delroy's compiled materials were eventually deposited in a restricted file category reserved for documentation lacking institutional resolution. While not closed to researchers, the file required special clearance due to its incomplete origin and the absence of verified outcomes. It was placed under the administrative heading, Pending Classification Internal Processes. The file did not draw attention again until 2009, when a graduate student in archival studies at the University of Northern Iowa, Martin Clear, requested access as part of his thesis on undocumented clerical transitions. Clear had no prior connection to religious history, but focused on anomalies in administrative data structures. His interest was procedural, understanding how data loss occurred under otherwise rigorous systems. Upon examining the Delroy folder, Clear noted the consistent use of indirect terminology to describe status changes. In particular, he focused on the phrase designation transferred, which appeared in the 1961 county filing and several internal documents. He traced its usage through other archived records across different institutions and found no parallel. The phrasing did not correspond to any standard civil or religious classification at the time. Clear submitted a records request to the county property office seeking original floor plans for the refuge and surrounding parcels. He was granted access to physical blueprints stored in a microfilm vault, including a 1955 site map annotated with hand-drawn labels. The map identified 5 primary structures: chapel, dormitory, apiary shed, print building, and an unlabeled rectangle near the western tree line. This last structure did not appear in any later filings and was not visible in aerial surveys after 1963. An attached maintenance ledger listed the structure under the name Holding Utility and noted modifications in 1957. The entry included the line Partition Sealant Installation Completed, Non-Residential Use Confirmed. The signature space was left blank. No further details followed. Clear attempted to locate any documentation showing deconstruction, repurposing, or renaming of the building. None existed. The 1960 inventory list submitted by the order made no reference to it. The designation appeared to have been dropped without reassignment. He also submitted an inquiry to the Iowa Board of Religious Oversight, a short-lived regulatory body dissolved in 1981, to request any correspondence related to building permits or zoning adjustments filed by the Order of Sacred Moderation. The board's records had been incorporated into the State Archive and were accessible only through interagency liaison. After a delay of several months, Clear received a response stating no files had been located. While not unusual for the period, the absence of any zoning notice was noteworthy, given the presence of a detached structure. Most religious properties documented outbuildings with specific codes, even if they were for limited use. A separate review of county agricultural filings from 1958 showed that the Refuge declared fewer acres of production, despite consistent reported output. A field originally designated for legumes was relabeled Internal Rotation Area. No corresponding produce sales were logged for that plot that year. Clear assembled his findings into a paper presented at the 2010 Midwest Historical Documentation Symposium. The title System Without Name, Case Study and Procedural Finalization drew attention among a small circle of researchers interested in archival incompletion. His presentation emphasized structural erasure not as concealment, but as the conclusion of a system's internal logic. In response, a historian from a Jesuit archive suggested reviewing the printing records from the Refuge's internal press. The print shop had produced limited-run theological texts for affiliate libraries until the early 1960s. Some volumes were catalogued by university libraries. Clear located 6 titles produced between 1954 and 1961, including spiritual commentaries and rulebook revisions. The colophons listed the St. Ignatius Press, but none credited individual friars. The final title, printed in 1961, included a small note in the appendix. Compiled under Terminal Review Authority, no authorial restoration required. The phrasing had not been standard in earlier works. Clear contacted the university library where the volume was stored and obtained a scan of the page. The term Terminal Review Authority did not appear in any ecclesiastical glossary available at the time. In context, it appeared to indicate a form of administrative finality that precluded further edit or annotation. No other institution in the order used that phrase in their materials. Around the same time, a librarian in Dubuque reached out to Clear with a scanned postcard found in the back of a retired abbot's personal effects. The card bore no date or return address, but the handwriting referenced St. Ignatius, Order Finalization Affirmed. The phrasing closely matched that used in the 1961 internal summaries. Clear compiled these pieces into an appendix to his thesis. He argued that the administrative language surrounding the Refuge had undergone a deliberate transition toward terminological abstraction. Roles became functions, names became designations, descriptions became procedural codes. He stopped short of assigning motive, framing the pattern as a reflection of bureaucratic enclosure. His work received limited attention outside of niche academic settings. Still, it contributed to a growing awareness that systems of religious administration could self-contain transitions to the point of non-verifiability. In 2012, a doctoral candidate in theological data modeling cited Clear's work in a dissertation on institutional self-resolution. The phrase, designation transferred, began appearing in broader discussions of archival theory as an example of procedural closure that bypassed external classification. A symposium held in Indiana in 2014 devoted an entire panel to case studies where internal record-keeping systems superseded external oversight. The St. Ignatius Refuge was mentioned briefly as a closed-loop model. No new records from the Refuge were released. By 2015, the property remained tax-exempt and listed as active under the Order's registry. No friars were named, no external contact was acknowledged. Satellite images showed the structures largely unchanged, though minor roofwork was noted on the main dormitory. The orchard appeared untended. The original 11 names continued to exist in partial fragments, initials, requisitions, facility logs, and abstract designations. None re-entered public registries. The term relocated, order discretion, was not redefined. It remained a fixed conclusion, applied without revision. The system that had processed them had not erased identity in act, but in form. Every trace remained present within framework, absent in naming. In 2016, the Office for Historical Integrity in Institutional Systems convened a symposium to evaluate gaps in clerical documentation across monastic communities. The event brought together archivists, religious historians, and public record specialists to discuss long-term retention, transfer protocols, and legacy classification practices. Among the sessions, One panel centered on structural omission and vocational non-continuity. The case of St. Ignatius Refuge was raised not as an anomaly, but as a precedent. During the discussion, several archivists noted the standardization of procedural language that had over time taken precedence over individual records. Phrases such as internal status adjusted and designation reassigned without external relay were cited as mechanisms by which institutions preserved continuity without publicly acknowledging changes in composition. The panel did not issue recommendations, but concluded that such terminologies, once encoded into internal systems, could persist indefinitely without external reconciliation. Following the symposium, the Academic Journal for Ecclesiastical Record-Keeping published an issue dedicated to unresolved archival categorizations. A brief case summary on the St. Ignatius Refuge noted that despite the absence of formal closure, the facility retained its listing under active religious function. The article included a timeline showing that no known correspondence had originated from the refuge since 2004, though annual tax filings remained current. In late 2017, a state librarian reviewing inactive archival holdings requested a space assessment and discovered that the Delroy folder, containing records tied to the refuge, had not been updated in over a decade. The librarian prepared a review memo to evaluate whether the file could be consolidated into a permanent retention category. As part of the memo, they reached out to the Order's mother house to confirm whether any additional materials could be integrated. The response arrived in the form of a printed letter bearing the insignia of the Order of Sacred Moderation. It was unsigned. The letter thanked the librarian for the inquiry and stated that all relevant matters concerning vocational status transitions from the period in question remain resolved internally and are not subject to retrospective dissemination. No reference was made to names, events, or classifications. The librarian noted that the phrase retrospective dissemination was not present in any previous correspondence. A search through the Order's older communications did not yield a single instance of the expression. Its appearance marked a linguistic shift that continued the trend toward procedural distancing. The memo was filed with a notation. Final reply received, no further outreach warranted. In 2018, a graduate seminar at a New York seminary reviewed the case as part of a comparative course on institutional self-regulation. A student team conducted a detailed timeline reconstruction using publicly available documents, interviews, and archived maintenance logs. The resulting report emphasized the consistency with which terminological changes aligned with periods of structural reclassification. The team found that from 1954 to 1961, each year in which a friar was classified under relocated order discretion corresponded to an internal materials order, dormitory maintenance log, or status abstraction without external confirmation. These patterns ceased after 1961, the same year that all subsequent requests for vocational verification were replaced with generalized summaries. In their conclusion, the students stated that absence did not equate to erasure, but to a defined closure through terminological displacement. The report was shared internally and cited in a footnote by a theological review examining non-replicable institutional processes. Meanwhile, the St. Ignatius Refuge remained physically present. Aerial surveys commissioned in 2019 showed minimal change in its structural layout. The dormitory roof had been recoated. The chapel exterior showed minor weathering. The grounds were unmarked by signage or updated construction. Public access was not indicated, and no visitor facilities appeared in state records. Property filings submitted in 2020 by the Order affirmed that the site retained its contemplative status under monastic operation. The statement listed the number of active residents as invariable per internal rule. No specific count was given. The reply was filed through a clerical agency registered to the Order's main administrative address in Missouri. That same year, a legal intern working under a nonprofit transparency initiative conducted a surface audit of religious property filings across multiple counties. When entering the St. Ignatius property records into the registry, she noted a misalignment between the parcel boundaries and the descriptive layout provided in the 1986 exemption map. Specifically, the westernmost section, once labeled as the Orchard Annex, no longer matched current satellite measurements. The discrepancy was minor, measuring less than an acre, but it drew her attention because the original exemption map had been used without revision for over 3 decades. The intern filed a clarification request with the County Records Office. The office responded that the boundaries remained valid under Legacy Religious Use Designation, a category that did not require resurvey unless physical structures changed. When the intern requested clarification on the western section's current function, the office cited an internal note dated 1978, describing the area as rotationally dormant, access not reviewed. No further entries followed. The area had no listed structures, signage, or utility filings. It remained labeled under the exemption map, but no longer appeared in maintenance records submitted by the order. In 2021, a visiting researcher from a Scandinavian Theological Institute submitted a formal inquiry to the order's central office, seeking documentation on the vocational transition process used between 1950 and 1965. The request was part of a broader comparative study on monastic autonomy. The reply arrived within 2 weeks and stated that the order does not maintain retroactive personnel enumeration under present protocol. The phrase echoed earlier correspondence from the 1990s, but with subtle variation. The term retroactive personnel enumeration had not been used before. Prior replies had referred to inactive status logs or designation sequences. The shift in wording was noted by the researcher, who added a footnote to his paper indicating that linguistic drift over institutional timescales contributes to the discontinuity of reference. The case of the 11 friars remained mentioned only in procedural language. Their names, roles, and contributions were absent from any restored registry or theological publication. Their final listings existed only within the context of classification. No commemoration was held, no contradiction was filed. Their vocational cycles, as preserved in administrative fragments, had reached formal closure through terminological substitution. By early 2022, the St. Ignatius Refuge remained a legally recognized contemplative site under the Order of Sacred Moderation, with no change in its filing status or administrative contact. Structure. A renewal statement submitted that Spring reaffirmed its status using the same phrase introduced in earlier filings, invariable per internal rule. The document contained no signatures, only an order seal and a routing code traceable to the clerical address used since 1984. Later that year, a foundation focusing on the historical treatment of unrecorded institutional transitions compiled a database of unresolved clerical reclassifications. As part of their pilot program, they included archival summaries of 38 institutions flagged in public records for inconsistencies in vocational reporting. The entry for St. Ignatius Refuge was the only one in the index labeled procedural finality, data confirmed absent. The phrase data confirmed absent did not denote loss or error. Rather, it indicated a completed process in which identifiable reference points had been intentionally replaced by categorical resolution. The Foundation's report noted that the 11 names associated with the refuge remained consistently omitted from necrologies, retirement indexes, and post-vocational acknowledgements. A linguistics researcher reviewing the report observed that within the submitted documents, identity had been replaced with positional code. This observation aligned with prior findings, in which clerical records maintained function and role, but detached those roles from individual reference. The substitution was not stylistic. It was operational. This was not erasure, but sequence displacement. Every record matched internal formatting. Every designation aligned with form. The gap lay not in contradiction, but in what could no longer be cross-referenced. In 2023, a minor filing correction in the County Plat Register re-verified the site boundaries for the refuge. While the western section remained marked as rotationally dormant, the Plat Amendment included a note that the parcel's use had not been declared since 1961. The county office labeled it inactive agricultural designation with non-reviewable purpose. This label echoed almost precisely the internal phrasing used in maintenance records from 1960, rotation plot status deferred without extension. The alignment of civic and institutional language underscored the closure that had occurred not through secrecy, but through replication of terms until review became redundant. No new residents were listed at the site. Annual tax exemptions continued to be approved without audit. Clerical routing documents were updated with each state record cycle, but remained templated and unsigned. Inquiries continued to be routed to the same central agency, which replied in standardized statements using rotating terminology that shifted slightly with each generation of correspondence. No personnel directory had been issued by the Order of Sacred Moderation since 2002. The last printed update referred to aligned vocational presence without listing names. An appendix stated that all assignments beyond that year were in correspondence with contemplative statute and not subject to enumeration. A 2024 ecclesiastical compliance seminar referenced this phrasing during a workshop on archival terminology. The seminar presented a case study on form maintenance in enclosed communities, citing the Refuge as an instance where status had been upheld by rule continuity rather than representational data. One speaker described it as an archive of referential consistency independent of identifying retention. There was no suggestion of misconduct. The vocabulary remained neutral. The forms were correct. Every entry followed procedural norms. No record showed error or anomaly, yet the names did not return. The 11 friars remained classified only within the phrasing that had replaced them. Their final functions were listed. Their last designated quarters were reassigned. Their roles, once linked to identity, had been transformed into segments of the operational chart. This transformation followed no dramatic breach. It did not occur in reaction. It proceeded incrementally, adapting as the terminology required. The original ledger that had included the names had been replaced by numeric registers, then by summary indexes, then by designation folders, each step preserving form while allowing the content to transition. No directive was issued, no closure ceremony held. Each friar, upon leaving the roster, was absorbed into the sequence that succeeded him. In the broader context of institutional documentation, the case remained unusual, only in its completeness. Other orders showed partial records, fractured updates, or vague terminologies. The Refuge, by contrast, had finalized each transition through aligned terminology and unbroken submission. No audit had been declined. No statement had gone missing. The names of the 11 friars remain listed in one place only, a private academic appendix held by a research institute that maintains copies of non-canonical records. There, each name is followed by the last known function and the year of administrative conclusion. No additional data accompanies the list. Each entry ends with the same phrase: designation closed, no residual index. If this story impacted you, if you stayed until the end, it's because you feel these hidden truths also need to be exposed. So leave in the comments the city you're watching from. This way we can see how far these stories are reaching. And subscribe to the channel. There are many other cases the world tried to forget, but we insist on remembering. This story is fictional. All names have been edited to protect the source. This video is for entertainment purposes only. But here's a disclaimer. It's based on historical facts.